My name is Thomas Clough, or Tommy to my friends, and my regiment was the Royal Artillery. And I joined the Royal Artillery on the 8th of May, 1945, which, if you think about it, was VE Day. I was going down to Woolwich, my depot. Everybody else was going home and calling me names, saying, "Go home, you silly so-and-so." Anyway, I joined as a boy at 14. I was only 14. The war was still on. It was VE Day, but the war in the Far East was still on. And my father, who was also a gunner, he was a TA. He went to France for the BEF at the start of the war, came back to Dunkirk. Then in 42, he went out to Singapore, Malaya, and he was taken prisoner by the Japanese. Meanwhile, I was in Blackpool, my hometown, with my mother and sister. And of course, we got all the war. I was only 8 years old when the war started, but as the war went on, you heard, well, as you know, it's history now, but World War II eventually came to an end. My dad came back, luckily. He didn't come back the same man. He was a broken man when he came back, but he was livid, to say the least, at my mum for giving me permission to join. And he said, "I can get you out if you want to." I said, "No, Dad, I like the army, I like the life, I like the discipline, whatever." I was 15 by the time he came back. So he said, "Okay, fine, let you go." So I went through my training. I did about 5 years, and then I suddenly got a post. I was in man service by now. I got my first stripe, and then I got an order posting me to Worcester, Norton Barracks, which no longer exists, where a battery was forming up, a mortar battery. And I went from medium guns, 5.5, which are a big, heavy gun, to these tiddly little things, these mortars. Mind you, they were big mortar. The infantry already had 3-inch and smaller. This was a 4.2, quite a big mortar. And the artillery had used them, Royal Artillery had used them in Burma to good effect. And they were an ideal weapon against infantry on open ground. Ideal. The other weapon, of course, at the time, artillery weapon, was a 25-pounder. When we were in Korea, there was another regiment, 45th Field, a Royal Artillery, with 25s. And they were absolutely magnificent. I mean, I saw them from the sharp end. Anyway, going back, my dad, again, when he knew I was going to Korea, again he said to me...
What you were just on about, you were in a barracks in Worcester. What happened after that? Was that where you were called up for Korea?
Well, I was in Senny Bridge in South Wales with a medium regiment, a medium battery, sorry. We were doing what they call depot battery. You looked after the camp and you did all the firing and everything like that. And I got a posting. It came out the blue. I didn't even know the war in Korea had started. It started in June 1950. And suddenly I got this posting order to go to Worcester, Norton Barracks. And I said to the officer who told me, I said, "Where am I going? Why am I going to Worcester?" And he said, "Well, they're forming up to go to Korea." And we all said, "Where the hell is Korea?" We didn't even know where it was at that point. It was a little-known country, thousands of miles away. We knew it was near Japan somewhere. But when my father heard about it, he said, "Be careful of the Koreans, north and south, because they had Korean guards, and they were worse than the Japanese, because Japan had occupied Korea and parts of China for 30-odd years. So during that 30-odd years, there was a generation who'd grown up with the Japanese in domination. So they were either press-ganged or volunteered to join the Japanese army, the Imperial Japanese Army. And it turned out to be true what he said about the military Koreans, not the civilians. The civilians were fine. Anyway, my dad said, because of that, he said, I want to get you out. I said, the second time. I said, no, I want to stay where I am. This is why I joined. Travel and adventure. And he said, okay. Reluctantly, he said, okay, I'll let you go ahead. Because by then, we thought, or everybody seemed to think, the war would be over by the time we got there, because we went by boat, troop ship. There was no air trooping in those days, except for emergencies. So it took us 6 weeks to get to Korea, and during which time, of course, we really enjoyed it. It was like going on a cruise to us.
Can I just ask, Tommy?
Yeah.
You just mentioned the fact that you'd never heard of Korea. Just tell me a bit about your early life in Blackpool, pre-war, as you were growing up. Just tell me a bit about who you are and your family life.
Well, as I say, I was 8 years old when the war started. I can't remember a great deal before then, except that I had a happy family life. There was my mum, my dad, who was a very hard-working man. He held 2 jobs down. Ladies didn't go out to work in those days. The man supported the family, and that was it. And he held 2 jobs down. And life was good. We went on small trips locally,
Did you, when you were being educated, was there ever any talk of, places like a geographical world, of the Far East and Singapore and Korea?
Well, what it was, as I say, I was 8 years old when the war started. Prior to that, I was in my own little world. I wasn't interested in going anywhere, really, except I might have wished to go to London or different places in Great Britain, I had no ambition to travel that stage, but when the war came along, my dad immediately, because he was in the territorials, immediately was transported to France. It started my interest going. I thought, well, if you can go to France or Europe that quickly, why not? But of course, at 8 years old and a war on, you couldn't go anywhere. But with my dad away, I can remember my dad going from Blackpool with a battery of Royal Artillery, local TA. They used to call it the Blackpool Regiment. And they went about 15 miles to Preston, to HQ. And I can remember being on the station saying cheerio and everything to him, wives and loved ones weeping, and I thought, he's off on a great adventure, Yeah. And they thought the same, I think. Or some of them did. I mean, men with families were a bit taken back by it. But anyway, the next night they were all home. Because it was only 15 miles away, so they all came back, But eventually they went off to France. And then we heard about the German advances in France. I could see my mother was worried. Well, everybody else was. I mean, we thought we were going to be invaded, of course, at that time. And then they came back from Dunkirk. I can remember my dad coming back from Dunkirk. And I can remember, I shouldn't have done it, but I did look. He had a small pocket diary. And I sneaked a look at it one night. I think they were both out or something. And anyway, I looked at his diary and I opened it on this page. And he'd penciled in Dunkirk Beach was like a butcher shop, or is like a butcher shop. He must have done it on spot. He got back on a destroyer, I think. I think originally he was on a hospital ship, and they were asked to get off to make way for wounded, so they got off, and eventually they got back on a destroyer. And anyway, the following day, I didn't question him, but I said to my mum, I said, what does Dad mean? The beach was like a butcher shop, So she explained to me, of course, because they were being bombed constantly. Anyway, my dad came back, and he was only back probably a couple of months. They had quite a good leave. Then they were taken back to Preston, where they were re-equipped because they had nothing after Dunkirk. They were re-equipped, and he was with a regiment, 88 battery, I think it was. They were equipped with 25 pounders. So off he went again to the Far East. And again, he was off to me on an adventure. And of course, I realized as the war went on, it could have been worse. It wasn't just an adventure. He could have got killed. He could have, Of course, our losses were tremendous. And so were the losses on both sides. And then...
Had you heard of Korea at that point then?
Never, no. I'd heard a little. Because war films started to come out towards the end of the war. But after the war, I'm trying to think, Bridge on the River Kwai, a couple of other films about Far East prisoners of war came out. And when the prisoners of war came back, you heard mention of Korea, but it didn't register really. And as I say, my dad was a changed man. He wasn't the father I saw off in 1939, 1940, He's a different man. And I did see him because I was in the army then, and I went back on leave. And I was in a place, I was back where what happened to me was, I got the posting to go to Korea, went to Worcester, and we were driving around Worcester with jeeps and all kinds of stuff with a big white star on the side, and people were saying, what's this, a remake of the war or something? Because the Americans had big white stars on the side of their vehicles. But of course we were preparing to go to Korea. And by that time, as I say, I had one stripe. I was a Lance Bombardier in the Royal Artillery. My troop commander, Captain Wisby, before we left for Korea, called me into his office. He said, I'm sorry, I've got to take your stripe off you. I said, why? What happened was, when the Korean War started, the British government immediately, especially when the UN decided to go in, to back an offensive against the North Korean invasion, the UN Defense Council, what they call themselves, as you know, they had a big debate on it, and everybody agreed that we should. Strangely enough, Russia were absent. And I think they were absent in protest because they wanted China to be included in the UN. And anyway, the vote was carried. So the UN decided to back the Korean War, or the Americans, because it was mainly an American war, because the Americans had retreated down to a perimeter around Busan. We thought it was going to be another Dunkirk, a Korean Dunkirk, and everybody would be evacuated to Japan, and Korea would become a communist country. But luckily, the Americans and the South Koreans held the perimeter. And then General MacArthur, who was in command out there of the Americans, because he was in command of Japan, decided to land the Marines, or his Marines, US Marines, at a place called Incheon, which was roughly halfway up the peninsula. In other words, he was going to cut the North Koreans off from their lines of communication, their lines of supply, and then hopefully we would advance and relieve the whole country, which is what happened. We landed when the advance was going forward. And again, everybody was saying it'll be over by Christmas.
Okay, let's pick up on that then. So you basically have had this very enjoyable 5.5-week cruise across to a place that you know very little of.
Yes.
As you just tell me those first few hours of what you remember of seeing of Busan and the landing and what those first few days. What can you tell me about that?
Well, obviously we enjoyed the cruise over. It wasn't exactly Wine, Women and Song, but it was near enough. Then we got about a mile out of Busan, off the coast of Korea. I mean, by this time, we'd had lockdown virtually, no lights and everything, because we were in a war zone. And we were on deck, about a mile off. We smelt this peculiar smell, and we said to the crew, who'd been there before, obviously, "What's that smell?" And they said, "Believe it or not, that's Korea." And we said, "Well, why does it smell like that?" And what it is, or what it was then, the Koreans, this is the whole of Korea, they used human waste on their fields for fertilizer. You know, we never heard of anything like that. I mean, horse dung on your rhubarb is one thing, but anyway, we thought, oh God, what are we getting into? But as we got closer and we got used to the smell, we got to the dockside and off we unloaded. And before we offloaded, there was an American Negro band on the quayside playing a mixture of military music and jazz, St. Louis Blues March and all this, and we were astounded. We'd never seen a military band like it, you know, and they were going backwards and forwards. And it was great. We really enjoyed it.
What day did you arrive?
What day?
Yeah, when was it?
Oh, I don't know, Martin. It was midweek. I think it was midweek. I mean, I don't know.
It was November, wasn't it?
It was November, yeah.
Yeah, early November.
Early November, anyway. And the weather wasn't too bad. We were still in battle dress. We were still in the uniforms we'd left UK in battle dress. And of course, we were armed by then. We'd been issued rifles, ammunition. And we were in a war zone, there's no doubt about it. And when we went down the gangplank, the band was still there to one side playing. And there were Korean girls, lovely girls, in Korean dress, handing out, of all things, apples. Because apples were, and still are, quite a favourite fruit, because Korea wasn't tropical. The climate is very much like ours. They still have the same seasons, but they're more severe. And we could tell there was a chill in the air, but we hadn't been warned about the winter to come.
I take it then you're on trains, or did you go onto the trucks?
No, we went by train, because typical British Army, our vehicles were on another boat. They followed us. So we went up by train. We left drivers behind to pick up the vehicles. And we had quite a journey through what was obviously a war-torn country. The North Koreans had invaded and they'd swept down through the country. The Americans had done their best to hold them back, but they were untrained. They were peacetime soldiers virtually. They didn't get enough people over from Japan, or trained people anyway. So there was no stopping the North Koreans. They were well armoured because Russia had backed them. They had Russian arms. And China obviously was backing them. Not physically, they were North Koreans.
But as a you know, so okay, you're you know, a regular, but this is really your first time you're experiencing a war-torn country.
Yeah.
What were your impressions of what you were seeing? Were you starting to get nervous? Was there a, you know?
No, not really.
How far did you travel?
Well, we weren't getting nervous. We were exhilarated because we knew at that point the Americans and the South Koreans and the other brigade, 27 Brigade, the first British brigade there, and one or two other companies were making progress. And they were advancing. Because by that stage of the war, the North Koreans, had extended their lines of communication. So they'd extended their routes for ammunition, food, supplies. The land was ravaged. They couldn't live off the land. There was no way they could live off the land, so they had to rely on supplies coming in. And the port of Busan would have been important to them, but we held it, or the Americans held it. And the advance was going well. We saw traces of the war. We saw the odd tank that had been knocked out. We saw stations that had been ruined. Because the Americans, one thing they did have at that stage was air power. They had aircraft in Guam, in Japan, Okinawa. There are various places around the Pacific were left over from the war, so they revitalized them and used them. So they had the air power, but the North Koreans had the manpower and they had the air, but they didn't have much in the way of air power. And I think if they had, it might have been a different story. But of course, the Americans had a campaign of stopping supplies coming down the south, which helped greatly, of course, with the advance. And I think in the end, it was a rout. They got the Koreans on the run, and they kept going, and they were non-stop. And they were passing their exuberance on to us. On the way up, we saw Americans. We met Americans for the first time, and they were great, you know. I can remember we were on the train. We stopped at stations which were deserted and everything like that. We took on water and this type of thing. It was a Korean train. It wasn't a US train. It was commandeered by the US, but it was a South Korean train. And I remember stopping at one place, and there was a convoy of American vehicles parked alongside the station. And of course, we got out. Any chance of getting off the train was welcome, because it was a fairly crude train, you know. It wasn't first class, it was British Rail. And talking to these Americans, they were all coloured chaps, they were all black. And we started talking to them, and they couldn't understand why we were talking to them, because American units then were segregated, and they were a black transport unit. And they were dishing out, because we hadn't seen it like they had, fruit juice, canned fruit juice, and all this kind of stuff, you know. I'll say that for them. The Americans were very generous. And we saw a few Koreans, but not many. They just kept out the way, you know, because there was still a lot of air power going on. Anyway, we eventually ended up, I can't really remember how long it took us. It took us a while, because we had to pull over and make way for supplies going up by rail, which they did, obviously. They were going virtually up to Pyongyang, North Korean capital. We ended up about the 38th parallel, which is the line between North and South, which was a border then, but it was an imaginary border on a map. And we then started, when we got to where we were starting to be operational, the winter had set in. And I can remember parking up in the vehicles and then having to go round. If you're on sentry duty, you had to go round starting up the vehicles every 10 minutes. Otherwise, they'd freeze up, even though they were full of antifreeze. The cold was beginning to bite. And apparently that winter of 50-51, although we didn't know it at the time, well, we knew it, but we weren't aware that it was one of the worst winters they'd had for quite some time, you know. And of course, we started to see civilian refugees. And that was the worst part, I think, of our introduction to Korea, was the refugees and the plight they were in, you know, because they'd been driven down at the head of the war. Not many of them had been allowed to leave the country or been able to leave the country. And so they were there. And as we advanced, they were starting to build up behind us, refugees, starting to settle again and try to do a bit of farming, whatever. Because it was a very barren country, really, at that stage. Although the Koreans themselves were very industrious, they tried to make use of what little land there was to grow food and stuff. Anyway, we became operational, but we still had no winter kit. We were still in the kit we left UK in.
Can I just ask, Tommy, were there any moments where that particularly stand out with the refugees that you saw?
Well, not so much then, but there was later on, because what happened later on, we advanced, we went up, we were doing well, we were happy, and we got to Pyongyang and beyond. And then we...
As far as the Yalu?
Sorry?
Did you get to the Yalu River?
We almost got to the Yalu. We're in sight of the Yalu. And then we noticed a difference. The Americans were starting to come back. And we went, what the hell is going on? I mean, I can remember we were in position above Pyongyang. I was what they call, we had an officer, we had a troop of mortars, 4 mortars, with a troop of about 30 men, and a troop commander and a gun position officer. And I was with the troop commander at the sharp ends because he controlled the fire of the guns, or the mortars. And he was called a FOO, F-O-O, a forward observation officer. They should have put an L on the end. But it was a FOO. And I was his assistant. I was a technical assistant Royal Artillery. It sounds posh, but it wasn't. I just carried his compass and his binoculars. And when we got above the Pyongyang, in the side of the Yalu, as I say, we noticed a difference. We noticed refugees. And we thought, well, why are they coming back? Why are they coming back? And what they were doing, we didn't know it at the time, and the Americans weren't sure at first, but the Chinese had entered the war. And of course, as soon as the Chinese came across the Yalu, the Americans started a retreat, and that forced the civilians to go before them. As they were retreating, refugees was going down. Now, we were under the impression, again, we didn't get too much information. American intelligence at that time wasn't that good, and they hadn't realized that the Chinese were coming. In fact, MacArthur said, no, the Chinese won't enter the war, because it would start the Third World War, you see. But what was happening was, the Americans were bombing places like Pyongyang on the advance, and the Chinese were sending MiGs, Russian aircraft, into North Korea to stop the American planes. And then there were our saber jets, the American saber jets, were fighting them. Once the MiGs ran out of ammunition or food or fuel, they would then go back into China. But our saber jets, the American saber jets, couldn't follow them. So MacArthur was asking permission of the UN to go into China just to have a go at these aircraft or airfields, you see. So what the Chinese did, they formed divisions, and they called them, they took all their insignia off, and they called them the Chinese People's Volunteers, making it look as if they were volunteers going to fight for North Korea. Of course, they had the full backing of Russia and the Chinese government. Russia was arming them anyway. And that's when the Chinese came in. And that's when we saw the refugees at their worst. Because bewildered, they were retreating in front of the Americans who were retreating. And there were horrible sights. I mean, especially during the winter, you can imagine. Barefoot, few clothes, few possessions, just wanting to get out of the conflict. And of course, later on, all right, we had to retreat. We were under orders to draw back, so we pulled back. We couldn't understand at the time, it made sense afterwards, but we couldn't make sense of it at the time, why the Americans were in full retreat. And we thought, well, why don't they hold what we've got? And it's something they probably regret to this day, because if they had held, North Korea wouldn't be in the state it is now, and we wouldn't have this trouble. But the Chinese were obviously adamant that they were going to reinvade North Korea and perhaps go further.
I have interviewed somebody who told me that they had seen mothers actually having to kill their babies simply because...
Yeah, I've seen that. I saw that. There was a bridge over a river. I don't know whether it was the Han. No, it couldn't have been the Han. It was earlier than that. Over this river, it could have been the Imjim. I don't know. And a mother deliberately throwing a baby over onto the ice. Now, we thought, because the baby fell, and as it fell, its arms were flailing. So we're not sure. The baby could have been dead when she did that, because there's no point in holding on to a dead baby. On the other hand, we saw, literally saw, women giving birth at the side of the road, and the Koreans crowding round to shield her from the weather. But then when she'd given birth, she just stood up, picked the baby up, wrapped it up, and carried on. Whether that baby lived very long, I don't know. But it's hard to describe the winters. During the winter, you could walk across rivers, because bridges were being destroyed by the Americans retreating, and they literally had to walk on ice to get over. But if you blew a bridge, you obviously destroyed the ice around it. So they would pick themselves over the wreckage. But the plight of the refugees, it's difficult to describe. I mean, we helped what we could, but we were fighting a war. The Americans may have seemed heartless, but they had to clear roads for military transport. So the refugees had to go off-road through paddies or wherever they could. But the Americans did their best to help them. Not initially, because, like I say, they were fighting a war and they had to get either advance or retreat or whatever. They were fighting for their lives as well. There weren't aid agencies out there, and I think probably of all aid agencies that exist now, there was probably only the Red Cross that I can think of. But of course, it's thousands of miles away from Europe. It was a country hardly anybody had heard of, and the war didn't get a lot of press in places that weren't affected. It wasn't until all the UN countries joined in the war, and they did. There's quite a lot. There's 20 odd, I think, came under the United Nations, that people started to take a lot of notice, and things started to get better. But at that time, it was chaotic. The United Nations were in full retreat, but we stopped at the old border of the 38th parallel, and then formed a line of defense and said, right, we're stopping here. I'm trying to think, desperately, trying to think who was in charge of us at the time. It was a chap called Ridgway, I think, General Ridgway. And he was killed, and then somebody else took over. Van Fleet? Yeah. Van Fleet took over, and he was an ex-para from World War II, and he said, right, no more retreating. We stay where we are, and we fight back. And that's what happened.
So basically you've started bedded in, and this is your point on the Imjin, is it?
Yeah.
And you have been assigned Gloucester Hill, have you, at that point?
Well, what happened was we retreated below Seoul, But the Americans stopped at the 38th parallel. So we went back the other side of the Han River, which is a river running through Seoul, and rested. We had Christmas there, in fact, which was a relief. The Americans flew fresh rations over from Japan, so we had a good Christmas. Anyway, we then started to advance again with the Gloucesters. In February, they took a hill called 327. And we formed up in front of this hill. It was, yeah, that's right, it was south of Seoul, and it was south of the Han River. And we formed up, and we had an American battalion on our right. And as I say, in those days, they were segregated, so it was a coloured battalion. It was the first one we came across, a black battalion. And they were good, they were very good. And they had black, I think initially they had one or two white officers, but I think when we met them, they were mostly black, and they came over to us because they knew we didn't have a colour bar. We were happy to meet them. And I can remember one occasion, and we had no vehicles except us, the Foo. We had a Jeep with us. And one night it was, the Gloucesters heard a moaning in the middle of no man's land. And they said, could be a trap, could be a lure to get us out there. But then they checked with the Americans and they said, no, they had an ambush that day, and there may well be Chinese out there. So the Gloucesters sent a patrol out and got this Chinese prisoner, badly wounded, brought him back to the command post. And they treated him best they could and said, right, he's got to go back to the aid post, forget what they were called now. Anyway, the first line of medical healing, And they said, oh, how can we get him back? And they looked at me and our driver. We had what they call driver ops. They were driver wireless operators. So they said to him, and Sam Harvey, his name was, from Birmingham. He said, well, will you take him back? About 3 miles it was. Well, I'm not going on my own, he said. So he pointed at me and said, right, you go with him. So what we did, we sat in his Jeep. He was driving. The prisoner was sat there, and I was behind him. Of course, it was an open Jeep. I don't think it was even a roof on it, but I was sat behind holding this Chinaman like a seatbelt so he wouldn't fall out, Anyway, we're driving along. Now, we've heard about this Marine who was acquitted, or pardoned anyway, in Afghanistan, this Marine sergeant who was accused of shooting a prisoner. And Sam said to me, you perhaps wouldn't want to mention his name, I don't know if he's alive now. He said to me, right, give him a kick and shoot him. Give him a kick out the Jeep and shoot him. I said, you can't do that. The bloke's wounded, He said, oh, get rid of the bastard. He said, I don't want to be travelling all this way with a Chinaman. So I said, no, look, he's badly wounded. He won't make a break. He won't do anything. Oh, okay. And we drove on. We drove to the aid post. And they took him off us. And apparently, he was able to give them quite a lot of information. Because obviously they treated his wounds and everything like that. And 10 minutes before, he'd been threatened with being shot. Whether he understood us or not, I don't know. But I often think about that. And especially when I forget his name, this Marine sergeant was accused, I thought it could easily have been me, kicking him out the Jeep and shooting him,
That's good karma.
Yeah.
That's good karma. That's a good story. Okay, so...
Anyway, I'll go back. We went back to the hill. And the next day, the Gloucesters took the hill. They were under orders to take the hill. It was the first real engagement they'd had. They'd been fighting guerrillas and people like that before. I don't mean guerrillas, Korean guerrillas. But they never had a full-scale battle, and 327 was the first one. They took it, no problem. And of course, we were supporting them. And I was with them as a fool, with my officer. And we went up, and I had on my back, I had what seemed like 2 modern-day car batteries, because communication was important. We had to keep communications between us and the mortars to make sure that they would fire and support the attack. So my officer said, right, you're a fit bloke, Clough. He said, put these batteries on your back. So I was fit in those days, not now. Put the batteries on my back, and up we went. And we got almost to the top. And our foo was here, and there was another foo about, it couldn't be more than 100 yards in front of us from 45th Field Regiment, Royal Artillery. 25-pounders, magnificent. And they were in front of us on foot, of course. And suddenly somebody shouted, incoming. And we heard a whoosh, and a shell came in. It must have been one of ours. Must have been. It wasn't a mortar, because you don't hear a mortar until it hits you. But this thing, I've got a feeling it was a 25-pounder shell. They were either clearing the guns afterwards or what, I don't know. But a shell came in and landed right in the middle of the foo in front of us. And it was strange because I had 2 batteries on my back. And because of that, everybody else threw themselves on the ground, but I couldn't. If I'd have done that, I'd have broke my neck. So I had to just lower myself. And as the shell landed, I saw the shell land, explode, and there was about 5. There were 5, I found out afterwards. And they slowly rose up into the air in slow motion and fell. And then the medics came in and cleared, so we then went on. And I learned, after I met the officer, the foo, I met him many years later in Germany. He had a plate on his head, funny enough, and he just reversed into a car or something. So he wasn't happy. But I saw his medals, got chatting to him and realised he was the foo in charge.
Amazing that he survived.
And they all survived except one. One was killed, a chap called Blakelock. And I still visit his grave in Busan. Going back to 327, that was a victory. And of course, there were pictures in the papers and stuff like that. And then we moved up to the to the Imjin. And we moved up quite easily with no opposition. And we made a line across about 12 miles. This was a brigade. We covered 12 miles, roughly. The Ulsters, I've got to think carefully because there were 3 battalions in the brigade. Like I say, the Royal Ulster Rifles, the Royal Northumberlands, and the Gloucesters, plus a Belgian battalion. We had a Belgian battalion with us by then. And I'm trying to remember who was in reserve at the time. It wasn't the Gloucesters. Could have been the Ulsters. Anyway, we were there on the line for weeks, literally weeks. It's like this, like weather is today. It was early spring, April, May. The sun was shining. You wouldn't think there was a war on. But we were sending patrols over the river to try and find out where the Chinese were. We sent about 3 or 4. I went over on a couple with my fool. And we found nothing, or they found nothing. I mean, the Ulsters, in fact, I watched them. It was great. They went up this hill with a piper, and they were all going to the pipes, you know. Some of them didn't play. It's a long way to Tipperary, but it was great to see it. But there was no opposition. There's nobody there. And it would have been a magnificent piece of film.
Can I just ask, while you're talking about this bit, did you have any contact with the Belgians then?
No, I didn't even know they were there, to tell you the truth. Well, we knew they were there. We knew they were in front of us, in fact. And we took it in turns to support them. Well, we would have done if the need had arisen. Because, like I say, we had one troop of mortars with the Royal Ulster Rifles, one troop with the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, and one with the Gloucesters. So we had to divide our time between the three and the Belgians. But up till then, there'd been no need, you see, until the battle started. The Koreans were on our left, the Republic of Korean Army.
Did you meet them? Did you deal with them?
No. You see, we didn't go on patrol with them. And we only patrolled mainly at night because, obviously, we were a brigade covering a divisional front. It was 12 miles wide. There were gaps. And the only way we could cover those gaps, the infantry did patrols. So we didn't do a lot of patrolling with them because with the Royal Artillery, with the gunners, what we do at night, during the day, we fire obviously on targets. And then during the day, we register targets. We fire on obvious places where they would come across. Road crossings, crossroads, things like this, certain hills, and we would register them as targets. And then during the night, if the need arose, we would get an instruction from the infantry, fire on target 1020. So we'd put it on the sights. The sights were already partly laid, and we would fire on it, or the artillery would fire on it. This is where the 25 pound was a great, And so we supported the battalions as much as we could. But we were with them when they were in reserve, and we were with them when they advanced all the time. Because with the mortars, you can't go too far back. I mean, Royal Artillery, you ask the infantry, Royal Artillery, 8-mile snipers, or drop shots, which is worse. And I can believe that, because like I say, on 327, I saw an example of drop shot. But that was war, you see, that was the way it went. Anyway, these patrols provided us with nothing, no answers at all. The Americans, I think, had a suspicion that it was a build-up, but it was very offhand, there was nothing definite. Nowadays...
It was a very clever advance by the Chinese. I mean, they did it very covertly, didn't they?
Well, the thing is, Martin, they didn't have radios. They had radios up to, or down to, I should say, divisional level, and below that, battalions didn't have radios. They might have one between 3 battalions or something like that, but they relied on bugles, whistles. They were mostly fighting a guerrilla war, really, against the mighty firepower of the Americans and us, of course, the United Nations. It's a wonder they managed to advance the way they did, but they had the men, literally. We had the firepower, they had the manpower, because there was no aircraft at that stage. You used to get Bed Check Charlie coming over once a night. He'd come over and drop the odd grenade or something if he saw a light, but that was it. There was no air power at all, except in the north. That was different. We saw that after we were taken prisoner. But anyway, I'm going ahead. All was quiet and all was well, but you could feel the tension in the air, really. We were starting to get a bit edgy because nothing was happening. We thought, well, what are they playing at? And then on the night of April 22nd, Colonel Khan, in his wisdom, gathered a patrol up under the command of Lieutenant Guy Temple. I think he was lieutenant, lieutenant or second lieutenant. Anyway, he was in charge of patrol, 12-man patrol, 15-man patrol. And he armed them to the teeth. His instructions were, if you can, If there's more than 30, forget it. But if there's less, try and snatch a prisoner to get some information. We want information, you see. The Americans are dying for information and intelligence. So he did this. A friend of mine took them down, in fact, in a Brengan carrier, which was an open armoured vehicle. They all piled in, took them down to the river's edge, left them to it. He came back, and they sat and waited. And then, during the night, all hell broke loose. They heard voices in the river. They opened up, and they tried to send a parachute flare up on their... They had 3-inch mortars with them. They sputtered and didn't come... No, sorry. Guy Temple tried to fire a Very pistol, which is a flare, and it didn't work. It was a dud. So then he ordered the mortars to fire a couple of flares. And there, in the middle of the river, was all these chattering Chinese coming across. Their night discipline was terrible because they were all chattering away. And of course, they just opened up. The patrol opened up on them and literally slaughtered them. I mean, they had 2 or 3 Brens with them, which, as you know, are light machine guns. And you're supposed to fire the Bren in short bursts, but they were emptying magazine after magazine. And you know, they had to change barrels probably at one stage. And in the end, they called for fire. They called 45th Field. We fired a few rounds. But of course, we're not much use on moving targets at night, unless you've got...
How did you feel? This is but there's a tension building, and all of a sudden, there's a contact. And
yeah.
It's not just a few pot shots, it's a major What was your feeling then?
Anxiety, I suppose. Well,
I suppose you just go into operational mode.
Well, exactly. Yeah, your training takes over, because I mean I'd done 5 years training. I'm not boasting, but I was fully trained, even though I was a boy soldier. I'd been in action on 327. And, you know, I knew what was coming.
Could you see any of this firefight going on?
Well, that night there wasn't much. Obviously, you couldn't see much. It was the following morning. I went with my foo up to what they call Castle Hill. We were sat there, and I couldn't see a great deal. Anyway, my foo said, "Have a look through these binoculars." And he handed me his binoculars, and he said, "Look over there." He told me where to look, and there was a gap in the hills, and I couldn't believe my eyes. It was absolutely. Although I was looking through binoculars, it was like looking at ants swarming out of a nest. There were literally, and I no exaggeration, there were literally thousands of Chinese. And it took my breath away, you know. I thought, God, we're in trouble. And he agreed, you know. He said, we are in trouble. They're coming in their thousands. We got to get ready for them. So, of course, he sent some information back to 25th Field. I think they had a foo up with us anyway, very shortly afterwards. And that's when the battle started, on the 22nd.
So you were literally one of the first people to see that Chinese advance?
Yeah. Well, it was strange because
wow.
that day, during the day, we had to go back, as a foo, we had to go back to the guns or the mortars to replenish, get food and water and stuff, and go back. And one of the gunners on the mortars said to me, Tommy, he said, how many are there? What can I say? I couldn't say there were thousands of them. And all I could say was, there are quite a few. Because I didn't want anybody to panic. Not that they would. They were firing mortars one after the other. I mean, there was a competition amongst the mortars. When you fire a mortar bomb, it goes up in the air, high trajectory, and the competition is to get as many in the air as you can before the first one lands. And there was a competition going on between the crews. And I think, I can't remember who won it, but that's the way it was. I mean, I didn't want to say, no, there are literally thousands of them. But I could see we were in trouble. The forward battalions were getting hammered. The Gloucesters were getting hammered. The company was coming back. And then on the second day, we got the order. No, sorry, it was on the first day. We got the order on the 22nd with the Gloucesters. The order was that night we were to evacuate. Not by road, not by truck, on foot. And we were to take our mortar barrels and sights with us so the Chinese couldn't use them. I thought, right, we are in it now. We're literally in the brown stuff, you know. So we did. We got up this hill that night, 325, whatever. I can't remember the name of it now. 325, I think it was. The hill was like that because we were going up the side where there was less likely to be any Chinese. It was literally like that. We were dragging our mortar barrels and sights with us. And of course, the Gloucesters are with us. They were taking as much ammunition as they could carry and as much water as we could carry. We took food, water bottles, everything. And we had to abandon our vehicles and our base plates. I mean, the mortar wasn't, we couldn't fire the mortars, but at least the Chinese couldn't fire them because you needed a base plate with a 4.2 mortar. The two, you can't hold them like you can the 3-inch. So anyway, we got up there and the Gloucesters had already sent a party to dig trenches, slit trenches best they could because it was very rocky and it was very difficult to dig in rocks, and you couldn't use grenades or anything because we would have attracted the Chinese and they would have known what we were up to, you see. Anyway, we dug in best we could, and that was it, really. We didn't know what was happening to other battalions. We learnt later, obviously, that they got out, fighting their way out. They literally got out with big losses, obviously. But we were stuck. And we knew that we were surrounded because they were on all sides of us and they were attacking us from all sides. It's difficult to describe how you feel when you've got 100 bloody Chinese coming at you, you know. But again, I've been asked, was I frightened? I said, well, it's strange to say, I know I should have been, but I wasn't at the time. It was in between I was frightened, in between attacks. Because when you were being attacked, your training took over, your discipline took over, you were with your mates, you just automatically, it was only a 303 Lee Enfield rifle, you had to keep cocking, you know. The infantry were good at it, we weren't all that good, but we kept it up. And mostly grenades were used. But we kept them off, or the Gloucesters kept them off, as you know, for 3 days. In that 3 days, there was a lot of wounded. And with wounded, you need a lot of water. Food wasn't an option. We had little food. I think I ate 1 tin on the last day before I was captured. And that was a tin of ham and lima beans, American rations. It was as salty as hell. And during the battle, my Fu, he sent word down to me. He said, "Tell Clough I want the Very pistol." So I gave him the Very pistol, which I carried that night, you know. And he sent back. He said, "I want some cartridges." I said, "I haven't got any. You got them." Anyway, I thought he had the cartridges for the Very pistol. And I thought, he thought I had them. So that was useless. He threw that away. Because we needed flares and stuff. Anyway, the second day, I think it was, Captain Farrah Hockley, the adjutant of the Gloucesters, called for an airstrike. And they came in as Sabre jets, American jets, came in. We were hoping it would be the Fleet Air Arm, but it wasn't. Although the Fleet Air Arm were off, British ships were off the coast. Anyways, an American came in. The lead came in, he dropped smoke, and then the others came in. And they came in behind us. We sat in trench. I remember there was two of us in a slit trench, and he came in behind us, looked up, and they dropped the napalm before they got to us. I thought, oh, God, here we go again. I thought it was going to be a repeat of the Argylls earlier on in the war. But then I didn't realize that the momentum of the plane carried the napalm over our heads into the hill in front of us. And they were spot on. The leader of that flight deserves a medal because he was absolutely spot on, because the others followed suit, dropped the napalm when he did. They took off, waggled the wings in salute. I mean, before that...
What was that like, witnessing that napalm?
It was terrible, really. It was obvious we wanted to kill Chinese. They were out to kill us. So we wanted them stopped.
Did it explode in the air? Or did
No,
it explode when it hits?
On impact. It explodes on impact, and I've been told it was formulated during the Korean War, because the Americans used to fly from Japan or Guam or whatever, and they used to have spare fuel in what they called drop tanks on the wings. When they got to Korea or wherever, they would drop the drop tanks to make the planes more maneuverable. And they noticed on occasion that these tanks, when they hit the ground, they still had fuel in them, and they exploded and caused chaos, you know. So they thought, oh, that's a good weapon, so they developed it. Probably put a fuse in it, I don't know. But I can remember, it's horrible to remember it, really. We thought, right, they're killing the Chinese, well done. But it was the weapon that was used. It was napalm, it was jellified petrol, and I can, now and again, not always, but especially at night, I can hear the screams. And I can smell the burning flesh. And it's not just me, it's the others. I mean, I've got a mate called Sam Mercer, lives in London. He can't be here today, he's not well. But when we came back from Korea, he wouldn't even have a paraffin heater in his home because of that smell and that recollection, you know. But napalm, it was a terrible... They used it in Vietnam. Yeah. And unfortunately, they caught quite a lot of civilians in Vietnam with that weapon. Anyway, that was the only airstrike they did. They did try and drop us supplies, but we were on too small a perimeter. The boxcars flew over. We saw them flying over, and we thought they're going to drop stuff to us. But it was impossible. If they'd have dropped by parachute, it wouldn't have landed on us. And if they dropped a free drop, what they call a free drop, we were too small. They couldn't do it. Now, in the meantime, we did hear a rumor, it was only a rumor, that the Americans were going to try and get through to us. But we thought, well, they're going to have a hell of a battle. Why can't they send the Argylls in? Anyway, it was, I think it was, I don't know, it was Filipinos, I think. It's what they call an RCT, a Regimental Combat Team, which is equivalent to a battalion. And they were headed by, apparently, we didn't know it at the time, Centurion tanks. Our Centurions, 8th Hussars. The Centurion at the time was on the secret list because the gun sight was something else. This Centurion was developed at the end of World War II, but never used in combat. And they tried it out in Korea. It was good as a gun. The 20-pounder gun was so accurate, they could pick a sniper off, even with a 20-pound shell, you know, for one man.
Just couldn't get around, could it?
Well, that's right. It was too hilly. Korea wasn't tank country. But anyway, the first tank apparently lost the track up this valley or this ravine and blocked the way for the other tanks. And the regimental combat team weren't going to go ahead without armoured support. So the attempt was abandoned. And I think it was at that stage that Colonel Khan was told, do what you can, but we can't relieve you. We can't get through to you.
Was that ever fed to you, that information, or not?
Not at the time.
No.
Well, it was in a way. We were told that they weren't going to make it, but we didn't think they would make it anyway. We hadn't. To tell you the truth, it's strange. I was in a slit trench with a mate of mine, and all the brown stuff was coming over, and I said to him, I don't know why the hell I said it. I said, God, this will make a good tale to tell when we get in the pubs back home. Men were dying around me, and why I said that, I don't know. It's just one of those things, But it's strange, we never gave up hope. And I think that's why, part of it, was why we survived. All right, we were fighting against these masses of Chinese, which eventually they said was 7-1. We reckon it was 10-1, but we'll take their word for it. And like I say, we weren't actually frightened when we were in action, when we were fighting them, because we were literally fighting for our lives. We knew if the little so-and-sos got to us, it was curtains, So we had no option. The Glossers have got a back badge for fighting back-to-back in Alexandria in Egypt years and years ago. And it was like that all over again. Rorke's Drift had nothing on us,
So, knowing what you'd done and knowing the damage that you'd inflicted on the Chinese, I might sneeze. Not going to sneeze. And the inevitability of the fact that, really it's a sort of a last stand and you may not make it. What was the fear like for capture, and what was the circumstances leading up to it? Did you just how did you surrender, and how did you expect it to be sort of a lawful surrender, or were you going to be killed?
I thought, when I heard the word, it was on a Saturday morning, I think it was, 10 o'clock, we're going. The word got round, we were going off the hill. And I thought, where the hell are we going? One or two of us said, where to, And it didn't reach me anyway, where I was, that it was every man for himself. But apparently that was the order from Colonel Khan, every man for himself. But when everybody started to go, that was it. Just before we took off, the numbers ones, that's the sergeants in charge of each mortar, was told to drop a grenade down the barrel of his mortar. 3 managed to do so. The other one, and I saw this for my own eyes, I was in a slit trench, he went to drop the grenade down, and he was hit by a sniper. And the only good thing about it was he died instantly. He didn't die of wounds painfully hours later. He died instantly. And that was an image that lives in my brain, Sergeant Danes, his name was. He died doing his job. And when I saw that, I thought, we are definitely in trouble. We're not going to get out. But anyway, when everybody took off, we went with them, obviously. Now, me and another Scottish chap, I can't remember his name now, I said to him, look, we've got to catch up with our FOO, our officer. He knows the country better than I do. He'll get us through, And he'd gone one of the first to go, I think. He'd been obviously told to kind of pave the way. So we went to catch up with him. We eventually caught up with him. And we came to a slight round. We were going down this valley. Now, the Chinese were picking us off now and again. They could have, if they'd had the firepower, they could have slaughtered us. But they were just picking us off. The firepower was at the front. Because I learnt later they were 5 miles behind us. Their front line was 5 miles behind us. So we didn't have a hope in hell. There's no way we could fight 5 miles with hardly any ammunition. I mean, I had 5 rounds in my rifle because, again, during the battle, we were carrying ammunition on bandoliers, and we'd been asked to give it up to the Brens and the Vickers, which was the 303. And we'd given it up willingly because they were our main weapon, you know. I can remember one occasion during the battle, we were quite near to a road. It wasn't a tarmac road, it was a dirt road, but it was a main supply route. And I couldn't, to my amazement, and to our amazement, we saw a party of Chinese on bicycles coming down this road. And they were happy as Larry, you know, as if they were on a Sunday afternoon outing. Because the weather was like this, it was good. And we thought, somebody's going to see them in a minute. And suddenly the Vickers opened up. And in a way, I felt sorry for these Chinese, because they were all, I couldn't see them distinctly, but I could imagine they were all chatting to each other and happy as on a Sunday afternoon. And suddenly this big Vickers opened up on them and just mowed them down, you know. And they were scattered, bikes, chinks, you name it, they were everywhere. Anyway, that was one thing. Going down the valley.
Did the Chinese ever get very close to your slit trench, your position as they were coming up the hill or not?
Sorry?
Did they ever get very close to you on any of the...
Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, they got within yards, you know. Because we were positioned in the middle. The gunners, probably the strongest point, as far as we were concerned. And the infantry were either side of us. But they still came at us. I mean, they were, especially during the night. Because what they used to do, during the day, a bugle would blow, an attack would come in, and we'd be ready for them, or the Grossers would be ready for them. But at night, they came in silently. They would send in a patrol, a couple of patrols, and perhaps blow a bugle over the other side to deceive us. And so we got pretty close. We got pretty close.
I mean, you're talking about hundreds of people attacking. What happens to all the bodies? I mean, are they just all left there around you?
Well, they were. And this is what was surprising with the Chinese, was the body count. Because it was the same when we were attacking previously. You wouldn't find you know you were killing them, especially with mortars. If you send a mortar over, a mortar barrage, to troops in the open, there's no getting away from it. The mortar was a good weapon in open ground. It wasn't much good for trenches, because unless you got a direct hit. The 25 was good at that. But anyway, the mortars, we were slaughtering them. And after we were taken prisoner, we saw bodies piled up, 12 foot high, and trucks coming down to take them away. Now, you'd have thought they would have had a digger or something and buried them locally, but they took them back. I don't know to this day where they took them back to. They may have taken them back into China, but I've got a feeling they buried them somewhere in North Korea, because the effect on the morale of the Chinese to see all these bodies coming back over the Yalu would have been tremendous, unless they had some way of having a corridor where they could transport them. You never saw, when you were in actual battle, you never saw many bodies lying around. You saw a few the next day, but judging by the amount of ammunition we expended, you see, the Chinese, although they had the manpower, they weren't that well armed. They had a lot of weapons, but it was short on ammunition because they had a variety of weapons. One of the main weapons we saw were Thompson submachine guns. They were the old Tommy gun that the gangsters used pre-war, and the Americans supplied them to China in vast quantities along with ammunition. But of course, the Chinese had used a lot of this ammunition up during the Civil War with the nationalists. They didn't have the War Graves Commission behind them, or the medics, you know.
Yeah.
I don't suppose they embalmed them like we did. But it was amazing how they got rid of the bodies. But we didn't really see them until afterwards. We were being taken prisoner, we were being taken back. But even then they were clearing them. Anyway, go back to where I was, coming off the hill, going up this sort of low hills on either side, this valley. I can remember distinctly one thing. Across this road where we were going, this track, it wasn't a road, there was a stream about as wide as this chair. And everyone in the battalion went down and had a drink. After boots and everything and blood and guts had been through it, we still drank from that stream. God knows what we caught. But we were that parched because during the battle, as I can say, we ran out of water first, I think. Then we ran out of ammunition. We'd already run out of food. We didn't have anything with us. And I remember, it was an episode I remember because I'd seen it in war films before the war, I think, probably when I was about 7 years old, where the Vickers machine gun, which is water cooled, would run out of water. So the bucket was sent round. Urinate in this bucket if you can. Of course, we hadn't had any water for days, so we couldn't. We did our best. And I think we cooled them down to a certain extent because they kept firing. But the Vickers, it's like the 25 pounder. It was so reliable, so constant, you know. Anyway, we were going down this valley, and then we came to a slight rise. By then, I'd caught up with our FOO, our observation officer. And he said, scatter, obviously, because together you make a better target. So we scattered out, going up this hill, and through the bushes, I saw a Chinaman stood up, and he was pointing down at us. And by his side, it was all done in a flash, was a light machine gun, something like a Bren, similar, and a machine gunner looking down. And this chap was pointing down, so I instinctively, pure instinct, and it was a lucky shot, brought my rifle up and fired. And he went down, and they both disappeared. So me and my mate, we then knew there was no hope. So I took the bolt out of my rifle, took it to bits, scattered it. I had 4 rounds left, I scattered them, and then I tried to smash my rifle up. And the Lee Enfield was a World War II weapon, probably World War I as well. And I couldn't make a dent in it. I managed to wreck the sight, and then threw it away, obviously. Went on into the next small valley, and then the Chinese descended on us from either side. They were obviously waiting for us. They had obviously rifles, bayonets poised. We had nothing. And I heard a voice behind me saying, stop where you are. That's it. And it was obviously one of the officers. I don't know who it was. It could have been Farrah Hockley, the adjutant. And we then split up into small groups, and they started taking us back. And then they took us back over this little hill where I'd shot this Chinese. And there was a group of Chinese there, with Tommy guns and God knows what. And my sergeant major, who we'd caught up with by this time, said to the Chinese, or indicated, to uncover this body. He was covered with a ground sheet. He wanted to see if it was one of our lads, so he uncovered it, and it was this Chinaman. And a lucky shot. I got him right through there. The trouble was, my sergeant major said to me, that was a good shot, Cloughy. Patted me on the back. I said, wasn't me. All these Chinese stood around, you know. I thought, they're going to let me have it, you know. But they didn't. It didn't bother them. And it indicated to me, if it had been British squaddies stood around, they would have been threatening me at least, you know. But it didn't bother them at all. And I thought how cheap life was to them. And I've always had the feeling, and I think it's true, research has been done that most of the Chinese in those battles in Korea were, all right, Chinese people's volunteers, but they weren't volunteers. They were either captured nationalists when China was at war, communists against nationalists, and they were captured nationalists who had been pressed into service with the Communist Army, or they could have been volunteers, anything for a bowl of rice, you know. And this is why I think they came at us in such numbers. They were literally cannon fodder, you know. Anyway, that was it. We started the long walk across the Yellow again, and we were impressed by American air power, because the Chinese are absolutely frightened to death. Well, you can understand it with napalm and everything. Absolutely scared to death of American air power. So we then started marching. Well, we didn't march, we ambled. We were in no condition to march. Marching is a drill. When you're taken prisoner after a 3-day battle, you're not in no condition to march. So we ambled up to North Korea. But we traveled by night for the first few hundred miles, I suppose, and then laid up by day wherever we could. And we just, at the end of a night's march, walk, we just dropped where we were. We could be in a village, we could be anywhere. And the Chinese fed us on what we used to call bug juice, or bug powder. Well, it was like a powder. The Chinese carried it round their necks in socks. Guerrilla fighters. And what you did with this stuff, if you wanted a hot meal, you mix it with hot water. A cold meal, you mix it with cold water. And I found out later it was made from soya beans. So it's, in a way, it was quite nutritious. But we didn't get a lot of it.
It's like a ramen.
Yeah, yeah. And
how were the Chinese with you when you were marching?
well, when we were first captured, they weren't so bad. They were fighters, you see. We were fighting them. And I think they had a certain amount of respect for us. But at the same time, we lined up, hands up. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know we were going to be shot or what. But what they were looking for were watches or anything valuable. You know, you took your wallet out and they took everything they could. I had a photograph in my wallet of my future wife, who was from Wales. They're saying Japanese. I said, no, Japanese. Welsh. They couldn't understand what I meant by Welsh, you know. I said English, British. Anyway, I won't tell you where, but I managed to hide my watch. And it was the only watch I'd ever had. I won it playing cards, in fact. In UK, not on the boat. I won the money and then bought a watch. And it was a date watch, which was fairly unique in those days. So I thought, I'm not having that. So I hid it in a place I won't mention. And I kept it until I was asked in the camp by one of the escape committee. He was the only one we knew, Ted Marion from New Zealand. He wanted my watch. And I said, what do you want it for? He said, we got so-and-so going out next month. I said, well, what if I want to go? Going out was a terminology for escaping. Not many, some tried it. Farrah Hockley tried 5 times. And if a chap like him couldn't make it, what chance did we have? Because as you know, later on he became a Major General, threatened by the RA, almost lost his life to the RA. Anyway, that's another story. Anyway, Ted came back to me. I said, all right, you can have the watch. I said, but if I want to go out, what do I do about a watch? Oh, he said, don't worry about that. A couple of months later, I went to him. I said, I want a watch. He said, what do you want a watch for? I said, isn't it obvious? I want to go out. Now, we only knew Ted as one of the escape committee. We didn't want to know anybody else, but he was our contact. Because we knew that if you were caught by the Chinese again, they would put pressure on you to give their names away. So Ted was the only contact we had. Ted came to me and said, right, I've got you a watch. I said, well, this is rubbish, nothing like the one I gave you. And he said, that's all right, it's the best one we can do. That'll do. And we got everything together. We got food. We were hoping to get water as we went along, because there's a lot of streams in Korea. And we got arrangements. We got a route out of the camp. Now, what I've quickly explained, the camps weren't like they were in Europe during World War II. They weren't surrounded by barbed wire. But they were literally surrounded by hills, hostile Koreans, and Chinese guards. They had the manpower. And they get these old retired soldiers from China, I think. And they literally surrounded the camps with men. They didn't do so much during the day, because there's no way you could get away during the day. You'd be seen. Because on one side of the camp there was a river, which was crossable during the winter because it froze over. But you couldn't escape in winter because you wouldn't last 2 hours out of camp, because the winters were really, really, really bitter. Russia had nothing on us.
But did you have Americans in that camp?
When we got to the camp as Brits, we ambled in, and we were surprised to find there were Americans already there. They'd been caught in the late 50s, and then early 51, and they were in a bad state. They were caught during the winter, mainly during the winter. Anyway, like I say, we got a route out through Ted, and it was across the river, because the river in August was fordable in certain places. It was only about that deep, a couple of feet deep, and you could ford it. So he said, all right, that's the way out, because the Chinese probably didn't expect you to go out that side. So he gave us a route in our minds, nothing on paper, out, where to go, which direction to follow. Because you've got to remember, it was in the night. So we did a recce during the day, reconnaissance during the day, so we knew where we were going. We could see where we were going. In fact, we did a dummy run. We didn't go out, but we did a dummy run along there, and there was silence, So we thought, right, we're going to do it. And one August night, I forget exactly when it was, we got our kit together, waited for the roll call. There was one every night. And as it got darker, we got our kit together and out we went. And as we were going through these bushes, we got within sight of the river, and we were almost in it. And Dave, my mate who was going with me, he was fair-haired, and he put on his head, you may have heard about them, a cap comforter, which was a woolly hat. You wore it under your steel helmet or whatever, or over your ears if you're cold, and he'd pull it down so it covered his hair, so it wouldn't show up. I was just dark-haired Blackpudlian. So anyway, he was in front of me, I was coming up behind him. We got into these bushes, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a round being cocked into a rifle. And I knew then we were going to be shot in the back any minute. And I tapped Dave on the shoulder. I said, Dave, it's all good. We've been recaptured. He couldn't hear me. He was going on, And I said, I turned around, faced this Chinaman. I said, stop. So he just stood there threateningly. And I tapped Dave on the shoulder again and dragged him round. And that was it. Whistles blew, lights went on. So immediately, we were separated. They slapped handcuffs on me and took me away. I don't know what happened to Dave. I did find out afterwards. He was virtually the same as me. He was locked away, and then they took us out. I was locked into a disused toilet. It's not as bad as it sounds, because it was disused. It wasn't in use. But the toilets out there then were pretty crude. Our toilet in the camp was a big trench in the ground with a pole over it. Although as time went on, we did better ourselves, put a roof up. That was a place for rumours. You'd sit on the bench, on the pole across, and have you heard anything lately? And oh yeah, it'd be over by Christmas. Anyway, they locked me into this disused toilet, which was probably about as wide as this chair, but at the end of it, it was about 6 foot in length, and at the end of it was a concrete block with a hole in it and a plank over it. The hole was the toilet, because I dropped a stone down it one day, which I picked up, and it was a hell of a time before it done the splunch. And that was my accommodation for the next probably 6 weeks. I lost track of time, but all the time I had these handcuffs on. And now and again a guard would come in and tighten it, because it was these ratchet type handcuffs. And then they would drag me out all hours of the night and duff me off a bit. And what they were trying to do was find out who helped us escape. There was no way, and I'm being brave now, sat here, but there was no way I was going to tell them. There's no way. I wasn't going to betray Ted. He was the only one I could have betrayed, but I wasn't going to. And it got to the stage where they were really putting the pressure on. Now, they couldn't pronounce my name, Clough, C-L-O-U-G-H, as in bridle. And they used to call me Cloughifer, which raised a smile on my face every time they did it. Cloughifer, you're telling lies. This was the interrogator that spoke English. Some of them spoke stupid English. We used to call one chap Hedgehog, and he stuttered and tried to speak English. But anyway, this chap knew what he was doing. I hadn't seen him before. And he put the pressure on. They said, right, Cloughifer, if you don't tell us, we are going to take you into China. We will probably shoot you, and we'll bury you so deeply you won't even stink, And I didn't take these threats seriously at first, but then it began to get serious. So I thought, I gave them false names, like Gary Cooper, Tom Mix, which didn't mean much to them. But when I tried Mickey Mouse, I think they realized I was having a joke, Anyway, they said, you were lying, Cloughifer, you were you must tell us the truth. Who helped you? Now, when we got to the camp initially, they started to brainwash us. And what Brian will tell you, what they did, they had us in a room or on parade if the weather was good, outside, and they'd lecture us about communism, how good it was, how well treated they were and everything. They were treating us badly, yet they led us to believe that communism was the end-all and end-all. It might be okay if they were teaching some poor peasant who's happy enough to get 3 bowls of rice a day and a roof over his head. But with us, it didn't mean anything. So we resisted, or a certain amount of us did. And we didn't physically resist, we just went into our rooms. We were supposed to talk about it, discuss it. We used to play cards and make up a discussion. Because they came round afterwards and we had to write it on paper and everything. And one of the things they did as well, which I must mention, they said to us, and this was after about 6 months, we knew that the Chinese didn't recognize the Geneva Convention. So we knew we weren't going to get any Red Cross parcels or anything like that. But we thought at least they might exchange names, prisoners, or dead or wounded, whatever. But then word got to us that they weren't doing that. The peace talks had started, and we'd hoped that they would have some progress. Anyway, the Chinese came to us one day and said, right, you're going to be allowed to write a letter home. We hadn't been allowed to write until then, except certain people. And those certain people were people who went along with their brainwashing. They accepted it. Now, whether they accepted it for their own good, to get an extra ration, I don't know. But some of them went along with it. Anyway, we call these we were the reactionaries, and they were the progressives. And the progressives were looked upon with favour by the Chinese. So when the Chinese started pressing me for names, I thought, right, I'll give you some names. And I gave them the names of about 6 or 7 progressives. In other words, I put the cat amongst the pigeons. And apparently that's literally what happened. I wasn't in the camp, so I don't know, but I got word afterwards, you know. And it got to the extent where the Chinese came back to me and said, we still think you are lying, Clough, and you were going to be punished further. And I thought, oh yeah. Anyway, the next day they took my handcuffs off. By that time they'd bitten into the flesh. They've faded now, but I did have scars on my wrist. They're still there, in fact. And they then put me, this was in the dead of night, they took me down, and I knew I was near HQ somewhere, their HQ, and they put me in a cage, which was hardly the width of this chair, about 18 inches, 2 foot at most. And it was literally a wooden cage, surrounded by bars all the way around, with a wooden roof. And it was inside an open kind of barn affair. It was open all sides with a roof on it, but you were open to the elements. And they'd taken the handcuffs off, which was a big relief, but I was in this thing. It was about 4 foot long. I mean, I'm only short, so it didn't matter. But I couldn't lie down fully, and I couldn't sit up properly. I was like this, bent. And we used to call it the Kennel Club, jokingly. Kinney, who was a Fusilier, spent a lot of his time in there. He got the George Cross in the end, but he was a real reactionary in the true sense of the word. You know, we used to call him an idiot, really, because he used to stir the chinks up, something terrible. Anyway, that's his story. My story was then, I was kept in there for a while, which was pretty grim. Yeah, it wasn't very pleasant. And of course, the guards, we had guards there all the time. And some were good, some were bad. Most of them were pretty good, I suppose. They just ignored us as long as we didn't do anything. But you were only allowed out 3 times a day at most. To go to the toilet, because the river we're close to the river, this river I was on about, because we were quite close to the Chinese HQ, headquarters. Although we couldn't see it, we were kept out of sight, I think. And we used to be taken out now and again. We could go down the river and have a quick sluice, but that was it. There was no other toilet facilities. You just went out and had a pee where you wanted or whatever. And of course, the food we were eating mostly turned to water anyway. So you wanted to go out more than 3 times a day. So we used to kid the guards. When the guards changed, the new guard had come on, and he'd say, I think it was WM toilet. No. And he'd hold up 3 fingers, and we'd say, yeah, only twice. And he'd say, no, you've been out 3 times. He didn't say it, but he indicated. So eventually what we had to do, and I know it sounds strange, but we had a kind of trainers on, which we were issued by the Chinese. I mean, their army had trainers. They didn't have boots like we did. I mean, I had a pair of combat boots given to me by the Americans, and I wore them through the battle, all the way up to the camp, into the camp, and of course, they were great. They were like wearing suede shoes. My mate's boots, British Army boots, were dropping to bits. on the march, on the walk up. But these boots kept going. Unfortunately, we had to put them outside at night, and they got whipped. They got nicked. I think it was some thieving Irishman. Perhaps you shouldn't include that. But anyway, I couldn't accuse him because they had a gaiter on, a fixed gaiter, leather gaiter, which were great. But he cut them off. He cut the gaiters off, so I couldn't prove they were mine. Anyway, that's another story.
How long did you stay in the cage?
Another probably 4 to 5 weeks. But what I was going to say was these canvas boots they gave us, we had to urinate into one of them. Well, that's the way we did it. And then poke it through the bars of the cage and empty it. The only alternative was to try and pee through the bars. Well, you held it out as far as you could and emptied it, you know. But we used to get round it somehow.
Was there other people in this barn in cages as well, or just you?
There were other people, but the trouble is, there must have been about 6 to 8 cages, but they weren't all occupied. And the intention, I mean, it's the same when I was in the toilet. I was cut off from anybody English anyway, any British or American. There was one night in the toilet, I heard a voice, an English voice, from the next door. So in a loud whisper, because the guard was outside, I managed to communicate with him to a certain extent. But it was only mutterings, and I couldn't really hear what he was saying. He had a job hearing me. But from what I gathered, he was in there, and there was another one the other side of him, another prisoner, a British Marine. And he said to me, this chap, I think he was a Gloucester, and he said to me, this chap next door to me is a Marine caught coming ashore by submarine, which they did. The Marines came ashore and sabotaged bridges and railway lines, and he'd been caught. And I had a strange feeling about this man next door. I suspect he was a plant, and he'd been put there to try and gather information from me. Of course, the next day he'd gone, and the Marine, or whoever it was, they'd gone. Now, in the cages, the same type of thing happened. You weren't within speaking distance of anybody else. The cage next to me was empty. I've got a feeling there was somebody in the next one. But of course, all the time, you were watched carefully by the Chinese. I think they even listened to us at night, hoping we'd talk in our sleep, you know, and give names away. But it was a strange feeling. I can remember one day sat contemplating my navel in this cage, and I heard voices, American voices, and I looked out, and I could see then, obviously, and there was a party of Americans going past. Now, whether they were on a tour or whether they were just being taken from A to B, I don't know. But one of them happened to look over, and literally his jaw dropped. It's the first time I've ever seen anybody where the jaws literally dropped, being shocked. And I could see him, he was looking at me in disbelief. I mean, we'd heard about the cages in the camp from chaps who'd come back, but we'd never actually seen them. I mean, I was taken down there in the middle of the night. I didn't even know where I was going. I was just suddenly shoved into a cage, you know. But this American, they were Americans, I could tell by the voices. His jaw literally dropped open. And by the time he could realize what he'd seen, the sentries, the guards had pushed them on. And I often wonder if that American has still got that in his mind, because I never saw or heard of him again, you know. Anyway, they eventually took me out and said, right, Clough, you have been sentenced to 2 months hard labor for abusing our hospitality. It's strange. I thought, what bloody hospitality? Anyway, there it was. And I was taken, it must have been about 4 or 5 miles at least. out of the main camp to a labour camp. And it wasn't as bad as it sounds. The labour was hard. It was hard graft. But we were fed better. They obviously had to feed us better. Otherwise, they wouldn't have got any work out of us. But all we were doing was literally collecting wood for the winter, because in the winter you almost hibernated. But you had to gather wood in the good weather to keep warm, to heat food, and stuff like that. So in the winter you literally hibernated. During the summer, the silly season, the escape season, you went out and gathered wood. And that's what we did in the labour camp, only more so. Because in the main camp, you went out, but you were only allowed to pick up dead wood, or wood that the Chinese said, right, you could do. Because the Japanese had literally stripped the country, or were literally stripping the country over 30 years of wood, coal, any raw materials, taking it back to Japan. So now, of course, in South Korea, they've got reforestation. And then we worked hard, and we were treated, I'm not saying better, but more like human beings. I mean, the only thing about it was, at night, we'd be sat in a room, and there'd be about a dozen of us, Americans, mixed Americans. God, I remember two Scousers, two Liverpool lads, and they were like a double act. Talk about little and large. One was 6 foot, and the other was about 5. And they kept us laughing, but we weren't allowed to talk to each other. And I've kicked myself for never having learned how to lip read or use sign language, you know. But somehow we communicated. We had to sit upright, and we were fed accordingly. And like I say, the food was better because we were getting the same food as the guards. They didn't have in the main camp, we had our own cooks. After a while, we got our own cooks cooking food, under the supervision of the Chinese, of course.
Okay, Tommy, I think we probably need to... What do you remember of the end of the Korean War for you, and how did it end in the camp for you?
Well, as I say, we got... I'll quickly go over my release from hard labour. A guard came out to me one day. Well, I was taken out. The handcuffs were placed back on me, and a guard escorted me back the 5 miles back to the camp. Now, when we got to the camp, the guard had no idea where he was, and we went into the American compound. He thought it was an American, you see. And he said, stay, like a dog, you know, stay, sit. Anyway, he said, stay. I waited there while he got instructions. He went to HQ, and a couple of Americans came over and whispered loudly exactly what I was up to and everything. I explained quickly, and the guard came up, and I was taken through the American camp. And the Americans literally lined up on either side and cheered and applauded me. And that did my morale more good than another bowl full of rice. I tell you, that really boosted my morale. Because the word got round. Any bit of excitement, because you were bored to death in the camp, you know, any bit of excitement cheered you up, you know, and the Americans did their bit then. Anyway, it wasn't long after that. Well, that was 52. We got through the winter of 52, 53. All the time the peace talks were going on. We only got a one-sided comments about the peace talk. The Americans were always to blame. We heard later, I mean, the Koreans would argue about the height of flags on tables and stupid stuff. But they dragged on. I mean, that's why we tried to escape in 52, because the talks were going badly, as far as we were concerned. 53, things started to get better. The Chinese seemed more tolerant, probably because they'd lost patience with us. It was no good brainwashing us, or trying to, you know, because we used to take the mickey out of something rotten. We used to have days where we'd go out and dig a hole And the Chinese would stand around. Why you dig the hole? We'd dig a hole there, and we'd go over there and dig another hole. We'd take the dirt from that hole, fill that hole. Anyway, we used to kid them on, that it was a secret, and that we were going to escape by tunneling, which was absolutely impossible. The ground was too rocky. Anyway, it was June 27th, 53. We were suddenly summoned to the square. I call it the square. It was in the winter it was mud. In the summer it was hard baked. It was a clay square. We used to play football and that. And they got us all together, and they literally surrounded us with guards, fixed bayonets. And we thought, oh God, things have gone badly. We thought, well, we're going to be moved, or we're going to be really bayoneted, or we didn't know what was going to happen. Anyway, we stood there. The commandant came, spoke at length in Chinese, and then an interpreter got up, translator got up, and spoke to us in English, broken English. And my mate said to me, he said, there's something going on. He said, they keep mentioning, he picked up the word, I forget the word for peace now, it wasn't often said by the Chinese, but anyway, he kept picking it up, He said, they're on about the peace treaties, or the peace talks. So we thought, we're in the shit, but things are going badly, And the translator got up and said, right, everybody, for you, the war is definitely over. Well, I'd heard this said to me before when I was taken prisoner. We were in this farmhouse just after we were taken prisoner. This Chinese officer came in. You could tell he was an officer by his sidearm. He didn't have a rifle. But the war is over. We curled up laughing. Just like the old war films, Anyway, this time they meant it. And he said, for you, the war is over. The peace talks have been concluded, etc., etc. And we just stood still. Literally stood still. We didn't murmur. And we just kind of glanced at each other. Is it true, And the Chinese were taken aback. Anyway, they then led us off the square. We went back to our billets. And they came then and said, aren't you pleased the war is over? We said, you can bet your life we are. We don't believe it. We don't believe you. And they said, oh yeah. And the next thing we heard was cheering from the American compound. The Americans are going berserk, And we then thought, right, it must be true. And again, things got better. We didn't get Red Cross parcels. Bless them, the Red Cross was still trying to get to us, apparently all through the war. But we got a little bag. I used to have it. I don't know where it is now. And it had British Red Cross on it. No, it just had Red Cross on it, the Red Cross. And it was a parcel of everyday things that you and I take for granted. A toothbrush, a small bar of soap, little things like that. And we thought, right, at last we're in touch with civilization, because we all live in a third world, And we knew then that we're on our way home. So it dragged on a bit. We were getting a bit anxious. And then one day they said, right, you lot, so they called out names, Clough, and we formed up. And that's when we marched. When we got to the camp in 51, we just about got in. When we got out the camp, we marched. And believe it or not, we marched to the tune and we sang it. It's a long way to Tipperary. And I've never forgotten that. Whenever I hear it now, on telly or whatever, on a show, or even a couple of Irishmen singing it on the Saturday night, I always remember that time we marched out. And literally then we knew it was over, because we then got on to, they took us on trucks across to a railhead, and we got on cattle trains. It didn't matter whether they were cattle trains or what. We were going home. And the Chinese said to us, right, you're not allowed to take any paper with you, any written documents, no diaries, no nothing. Not that we had much, because we didn't have much in the camp. But I had a list of people, names and addresses of Americans, because the Americans because we were next door to each other, the Americans used to come over to us now and again. We'd have sing-songs, especially country and western, stuff like that, you know. And I got to know quite a few of them. And I got this paper and I thought, what the hell am I going to do? And I had a block of the old carbolic soap. You remember the old carbolic soap? And I cut it in two and hollowed it out and put this paper in the middle of it, soldered it up again, and had it in my Red Cross bag. Then on the train down, we were stopped quite a lot. And we were searched and this, that, and the other. And got a bit worrying because anybody found with anything, they'd take them off the train and take them back to the camp to interrogate them and this, that, and the other. So I got a bit worried and I chickened out. And I threw this bar of soap because they were catching on. They were opening this, you know, anything, toothpaste. So I threw it out the train. It's probably some Korean took it and washed his smalls with it. I wondered what this bit of paper was. But I lost my contacts, you know, with Americans. Anyway, we were taken down to a holding camp in the north, just north of the border. Names are read out daily, half a dozen now, 12 next day. And of course you waited with bated breath for your name to be called. Eventually, Clough was called. So Clough happily hopped onto a truck, and we were taken down and handed over to Americans. And it was a strange feeling because as you got off the truck, I saw the blokes getting off the truck and actually shaking hands with the Chinese. And I would shake hands with a Chinaman I met now if he was in the battle. I'd be quite happy to shake his hand now. But then I was in no mood to shake a Chinaman's hand. And I just ignored them. And then we were handed over to the Americans. And we were deloused, of course, one of the first things we met. And one of the first things we saw were American nurses, females. We hadn't seen a decent female in 3 years. So we were all agog, you know, but they were very casual. On your way, Buster. We got deloused, showers, clean kit, uniform. We were handed over, literally, to the WVS. It's now the WRVS. And they really deserve that royal. Because they really looked after us. We were fed, watered. What would you like? Anything you wanted. Do you want to send a telegram or anything to your family back home? So one of the things I did through the WVS was send a big bunch of flowers to my parents in Blackpool. And of course they were photographed for the local paper. Next day, they didn't keep us 1 day more in Korea. They flew us because Korea, Seoul, was flat, absolutely flat, devastated. There was no facilities there, so they got us to Japan as quickly as they could. And the Australians flew us out the next day in Dakotas. And when we got on the Dakota at Kimpo Airfield near Seoul, it still exists. There's a military airfield now. And the pilot got on, and we couldn't get over it. He was drunk, Australian pilot, drunk as a skunk. And there's two blokes holding him either side, you see. And some of the blokes looking at him, and he'd be all right once he gets behind the wheel. They took him into the cockpit, and a couple of the lads, they were going to get off. Anyway, the pilot then came back and said, it's all a joke, lads. Of course, we cursed him in a soldierly manner. And we got to Japan, and the troop ship we should have caught was no longer there. It'd taken off, and it was on its way. They said, don't worry, we'll keep you here 4 days, and then you'll fly to Singapore to catch it up. So we had 4 days in Japan. with 3 years back pay, and Japan, wine, women and song, not necessarily in that order, but you can bet your life we enjoyed it. And I'll give the Red Caps, the military police, their due. In Curie, in Japan, it was a Commonwealth base. There was a curfew at the time. It was only 6 years after World War II, 7 years. And there was still a curfew on for Commonwealth troops, 11 o'clock. So 11 o'clock that night, we were in and going to town, for the first time. We drew our money, we were out. And they came round, the Red Caps came round and rounded everybody up, everybody they saw in the truck. We got to the base and they said, right, everybody out. And they knew who we were by our smart new kit. And they said, right, you, off you go. Back on the truck. And they took us back into Curie. The rest had to go into camp. And we had 4 days of, as I say, wine, women and song. And then we started on our way back.
So what did you make of Seoul, though, after all that time?
Well, I was amazed. Before I went, you see, I'd had phone calls from Korea, from lovely ladies and men, saying, when you come to Korea, I want to shake you by the hand. And I said, well, I'll be amongst others, I won't be on my own. They said, yeah, but you have waited until 2010 to come back. And they said, why are you coming back? And I told them, I said, well, I want to see what you've done because I've heard about it. And I'd seen it on television. My pals had come back and said, you've got to go back to Korea to see what they've done to the country. And I obviously believed them. I couldn't disbelieve them because the comparison between North and South, well, there is no comparison really. It's like another world, North Korea. Anyway, I went back with Dennis, and I was overawed. I got to Kimpo Airfield, Incheon Airfield now, a civilian airfield, which the Koreans, again, had built on the mudflats of Incheon, where the landing was made by MacArthur in 1950, 51, sorry. And I didn't believe I was in Korea. I did, obviously, because I knew about it by word of mouth and by seeing it on film. But it was so hard to believe. All right, it was, 50 years later? But the transformation was, it was like watching a film and seeing devastation in one scene and seeing a rebuilt Korea in another. Because I hadn't seen it being built. It was one bang. And I said to the girl, the courier who was with us, because as soon as I got to the airport, I had a camera stuck in front of my face and a mic and welcome and all this kind of thing. And they said, why is it taking you so long to come back? And I said, well, I was in the army, I was busy, I had a family to bring up and all this kind of thing. And they said, well, welcome back. What do you think of Korea? What do you think of Seoul? I said, well, where are we? And of course, we were traveling from the airport to the capital. It's about 10, 12 miles. And I said, well, I don't know where we are. They said, you're in Seoul. I said, never. They obviously filmed my reaction, They said, why are you shaking your head? And I said, well, I just disbelief. And I've got to give it you. It was, you see, people have asked me over the years. I mean, I lost a lot of good friends in Korea. One of the first men to die in the camp was a man, and I hope his relatives are watching, because a chap called Taffy Mosley, he was in the Army Catering Corps. He was our troop cook. He was the only Army Catering Corps man with us. The Glossers had their own cooks. We had one man in our troop of 30. His name was Taffy Mosley. He was Welsh, obviously. And he was our cook. And he looked after us with the food. I mean, we had our own food in the FOO, in the forward observation. But whenever we came back to the mortars, he was ready there with food for us. We used to bring, we had a lot of American rations, which we'd got when the Americans retreated from North Korea and left a lot of stuff behind to be destroyed. So we looted American rations, so we had a lot of that. But he could make good food out of a few biscuits, or hardtack as we called it, the hardtack biscuits we had. But unfortunately, I mean, obviously in his position, he was one of the best fed men in the troop. You can't blame him. But the walk, and again I say it was a walk up to the camp. There's no way we could march. We got up to the camp. By that time, we'd been 5 weeks walking there, 500 miles, and we were on our knees, literally. And although we'd been fairly fit when we were captured, 5 weeks later, our strength was gone. So we were fighting not just the Chinese, we weren't fighting them any longer. We were fighting them in our own way, but we were also fighting to keep fit. We were fighting the lack of food, or the lack of good food anyway, and you know, the diet wasn't that good. Talk about losing weight quickly. Go on a Chinese diet. Anyway, obviously when we got there, we weren't in any fit condition. The Americans in the compound next to us were even worse. They'd been captured over the winter, and there were a lot of them dying. I mean, I saw in one day 15 men being taken up to what the Americans called Boot Hill. Again, American, like ours, a bit black humor. So their morale...
Sorry, Tommy, just finish the story about
Taffy.
Yeah.
Well, Taffy, he wasn't in my squad, but we were in the same compound. And the word got round. We knew when anybody was ill. The one thing about us Brits, if a chap next to you couldn't eat his food, you more or less forced him to eat it. Other people would say, oh, I'll have your share, and let him go. But we more or less forced it, because we knew if you went 2 days without food, you were on a downhill slope. You weren't going to last. You had to eat, regardless of what you were eating. We had, I mean, the rubbish we had during that first year, which was bad. I won't repeat it now. It's almost like Big Brother or whatever they call it, whether eating slugs in Australia or on an island in Australia. It makes me shudder when I say that now. Anyway, Taffy went downhill pretty quick. And we rallied round him. We tried to get him to eat and get him there. But he'd been wearied by this walk up. And you could see his strength going. It was hard to watch. But we did our best for him. We made him comfortable. I mean, in the last few years of World War II, we saw concentration camps being liberated. And unfortunately, that's what Taffy reminded me of. When I was in Germany, after the war, I went to Belsen and saw the graves there, and then saw the film and everything like that. Taffy was in a real bad state, but I can assure any relatives that are watching, I never found out where he was from. He could have been from Newport, I'm not sure, in Wales. I should have found out more about him. But you can take it from me that we did our best for Taffy, and anybody else, there's a few others, died after him. I think he died July 51, not long after we got to the camp. But I can assure his relatives he didn't suffer.